I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the middle of a delicate operation trying to convince a certain red-headed secretary over the phone that a Thursday night without me was a Thursday night waste one. The doorbell rang. Since it was 4:00 p.m. and Wolfe was up in the plant rooms with Theodore and 10,000 orchids, the responsibility of dealing with the outside world fell squarely on my shoulders. I hung up on Lilish, was going to say no anyway, and I prefer to keep my rejection percentages unofficial, and crossed the hallway. Through the one-way glass of the front door, I saw a man who looked like he had been assembled from leftovers in a bargain basement. He was wearing a hat that had seen better decades and clutching a manila envelope as if it contained the secret to cold fusion. I opened the door 2 inches, which is the standard brownstone welcome for people who haven't made an appointment. Yes, for Mr. Wolfe, the man wheezed. He didn't look like a messenger. He looked like a man who had run 3 blocks because he couldn't afford a taxi. It's from Arthur Vance. He said it had to be delivered today, March 13th. Not a day sooner, not a day later. I felt a slight twitch in my left eyebrow. That's a neat trick, I said, considering Arthur Vance was found in his library 3 days ago with a letter opener where his necktie should have been. Dead men aren't usually big on logistics. The man turned a shade of grey that matched his suit. I'm a clerk at his firm. He left instructions in the vault. A timed release. I don't know what's in it, and I don't want to know. He shoved the envelope at me, turned tail, and vanished toward 8th Avenue faster than a man of his age should be able to move. I looked at the envelope. It was addressed to Nero Wolfe in a shaky, elegant hand. I closed the door, bolted, and entered the office. I sat at my desk, flipped the envelope onto the blotter, and waited. At 6:00 p.m. sharp, the sound of the elevator signaled that the genius was descending. Wolfe entered the room, his 500 pounds of displacement moving with the usual deceptive silence. He didn't look at me. He headed straight for his oversized chair, settled his bulk into it with a sigh of weary satisfaction, and rang for Fritz. "Beer," he muttered. "Coming up," I said, along with a small problem in a manila envelope. "It's from Arthur Vance." Wolfe's eyes, which had been half closed in anticipation of the beer, flickered open. He stared at the envelope as if it were a cockroach on a clean tablecloth. "Mr. Vance is dead." The papers were quite repetitive about it. He was also a planner, I noted. This was delivered by a clerk who looked like he'd seen a ghost. Timed release from a vault. He wanted you to have it today. Fritz entered with the tray, the bottles, and the glass. Wolfe waited until the foam had settled to its precise half-inch margin before he spoke again. "It is an intrusion," Wolfe remarked, his voice heavy with the injustice of a dead man demanding his time. "I did not know Mr. Vance. I did not like his politics, and I found his monographs on international trade to be derivative." "He didn't send you a monograph," I said, picking up the envelope and holding it out. "He sent you a job, or a confession, or maybe a turtle soup recipe. There's only one way to find out, and it doesn't involve staring at it." Wolfe made a face, which for him is equivalent to a 3-act tantrum. He extended a large, manicured hand that rarely touched anything more dangerous than a salad fork and took the envelope. He used the gold letter opener ID bought him for Christmas 2 years ago. He read the single sheet of paper inside. He read it twice. Then he leaned back, his eyes following the flight of a dust mote in the late afternoon sun. "Archie." "Yes, sir. Mr. Vance was murdered on Tuesday. Today is Friday." In this letter, written 3 weeks ago, he provides a list of 5 names. He suggests that if he were to die by violence, one of these 5 would be responsible, but none of them would have a motive that a common policeman could find. "That's handy," I said, reaching for my notebook. "Does he say why he sent it to you instead of the DA?" Because Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of genuine annoyance, "He claims to have solved a logic puzzle I published in the American Journal of Heuristics in 1922. He says that as the only other man who understands the integrity of the inevitable, I am the only one he trusts to see the pattern." "Great," I sighed. "A fan letter from a corpse. Who are the lucky 5? Wolfe handed me the paper. I glanced at the names. They weren't bargain basement types. They were the kind of names that appeared in the society pages and the who's who of Manhattan industry. "Is this the case?" I asked. Wolfe looked at the beer glass. It was empty. He looked at the clock. It was nearly time for dinner lamb kidneys with Mountain Dews, if the smell from the kitchen was any indication. "It is not a case," Wolfe said firmly. "It is an impertinence. However," he paused, his fingers drumming a rhythmic beat on the arm of his chair. "He mentions a specific vintage of Madeira that he has willed to me in the event of my successful identification of his killer. A 1875 de Oliveira. Ah, I said. So it's not about integrity being inevitable. It's about the stomach. It is about justice, Archie, and the fact that my office has been disturbed by a dead man's messenger. We cannot allow such things to go unaddressed. Phone the first name on that list. Tell him I require his presence at 9 tonight. Tell him if he refuses, I shall be forced to turn this letter over to Inspector Cramer." I headed for the phone. "And if he asks what's in the letter?" "Tell him," Wolfe said, closing his eyes, "that it is a map of his conscience. He will understand." I started dialing. It looked like my date with Lily was officially moved to the cancelled column. The transition from a quiet afternoon to a bustling evening at the brownstone is never a smooth one, mostly because Wolfe treats every visitor like a personal affront to his atmospheric pressure. By 8:45, I had the office prepped. The red leather chair was waiting for the primary target, and ID rounded up enough folding chairs to accommodate a small jury, just in case. Fritz was in the kitchen, ostensibly preparing the evening's coffee, but likely sharpening his intuition. He can smell a lie from 40 yards away, usually before it even leaves the suspect's throat. Wolfe was behind his desk, the picture of immobile grandiosity. He had a glass of beer, his second since dinner, and was staring at the portrait of Sherlock Holmes on the far wall with what looked like professional jealousy. He hates it when the dead reach out to him, but he hates even more the idea that a puzzle might exist in New York that he hasn't deconstructed. The doorbell rang at precisely 9 o'clock. I went to the front door, checked the view through the glass, and saw a huddle of expensive overcoats. I didn't just have one visitor, I had the whole set. They were huddled together on the stoop like penguins in a blizzard, though the weather was actually quite clear and mild for March. I opened the door and retreated. "Come on, gentlemen. Watch the rug, it's older than most of your portfolios." They filed in, bringing the scent of rain, damp wool, and high-end anxiety. First was Julian Vainwaite. No, I mean Julian Thorne. I have to keep my name straight. Wolfe hates it when I butcher a pedigree. Thorne was the nephew, a man whose chin seemed to be retreating from his responsibilities. Next came Evelyn Vance, the widow, wearing black that looked like it cost more than my car. Then there was a lawyer named Halloway, a woman with a briefcase that looked like it was fused to her arm, and a younger man named Miller, who kept adjusting his spectacles as if the world were slightly out of focus. I led them into the office. Wolfe didn't stand. He doesn't stand for anything less than a king or a particularly impressive botanical specimen. He merely inclined his head about 1/8 of an inch, which is his version of a grand welcome. "Please be seated," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the pens on my desk. "I am Nero Wolfe. This is Mr. Goodwin. He is the one who will be taking notes, so I suggest you speak clearly and with a modicum of honesty. It saves time." "This is an outrage," Wolfe, Halloway snapped, remaining standing. She had that legalistic bark that usually works on clerks but bounces off Wolfe like a rubber ball off a battleship. "To suggest that Arthur left a letter accusing us, I suggested nothing of the sort," Wolfe interrupted, his eyes shifting to her with the speed of a closing trap. "I merely stated that I have a communication from the deceased. Whether it is an accusation or a recipe for mediocre goulash depends entirely on your reactions to it. Sit down, madam. You are obstructing the light." She sat. The room grew heavy with the kind of silence you only find in a funeral parlor or a courtroom right before the verdict. Thorne was fidgeting with a gold lighter, flipping the cap open and shut until Wolfe glared at him, at which point the lighter vanished into his pocket. My husband was a disturbed man toward the end, Evelyn Vance said, her voice steady but thin. He saw patterns where there were none. He believed his business rivals were literal demons. If he wrote you a letter, Mr. Wolfe, it was the product of a failing mind that managed to secure 1875 de Oliveira Madeira for my cellar, Wolfe remarked, his eyebrows going up. A man with such taste is rarely delusional about the people in his immediate orbit. He was a man of precision. He understood that his death was not an accident of fate, but a calculation of intent. He was stabbed in a locked house. Miller, the younger man, whispered. He looked like he wanted to be elsewhere. The police said it was a disgruntled servant. They've already questioned everyone. The police, Wolfe said, look for fingerprints and blood spatters. I look for the integrity of the inevitable. Mr. Vance knew that his life had reached a point where his presence was an inconvenience to one of you. He did not tell me who. He gave me a list. You were on that list. I watched them. Thorne looked bored, which is usually a sign of extreme terror. The widow was staring at Wolfe with a cold, calculating intensity that made me glad I wasn't the one she was married to. Holloway was already scribbling notes, likely preparing a dozen ways to sue us for defamation. I have no intention of turning this letter over to the authorities just yet, Wolfe continued, leaning back until the springs of his chair groaned in protest. Inspector Cramer is a man of many virtues, but subtlety is not among them. He would treat this office like a crime scene, and I find that prospect intolerable. Therefore, I shall conduct my own inquiry. She will begin the sketches. I want the movements of these 5 individuals for the 48 hours preceding Mr. Vance's death. I want their bank statements, their recent arguments, and the brand of ink they prefer, Fritz. Fritz appeared at the door as if he'd been summoned by telepathy. Yes, Mr. Wolfe, refreshments are in order. These people are nervous. Nervous people have dry throats, and dry throats lead to reticence. Bring the cider, the Ard's cider. As Fritz disappeared, I noticed something. Miller, the nervous one with the glasses, wasn't looking at Wolfe. He was looking at the bottom drawer of Wolfe's desk, the drawer where we keep the most sensitive files. It was a small movement, just a flicker of the eyes, but in this house, a flicker is as loud as a shout. We aren't staying, Holloway said, rising again. You have no legal standing to hold us. None at all, Wolfe agreed pleasantly. But if you leave now, Archie will be forced to follow you. He is very persistent, quite loud, and he has a tendency to ask embarrassing questions in front of neighbours. It would be much simpler to stay and convince me that Arthur Vance was mistaken. They stayed. They didn't have a choice. The brownstone had closed its jaws, and Wolfe was just beginning to chew. I opened my notebook, sharpened my pencil, and looked at Thorne. "All right, Mr. Thorne," I said, giving him my most encouraging street-smart grin. "Let's start with your whereabouts on Tuesday night," and try to make it interesting. I hate boring alibis. The office felt smaller suddenly. The outsiders had brought their shadows with them, and for the first time in a long time, the sanctity of Wolfe's world felt genuinely threatened, not by violence, but by the sheer weight of the secrets they were sweating into our upholstery. By the time the clock on the mantel struck 11, the office smelled like expensive perfume and cheap excuses. Wolfe had dismissed the congregation with a wave of his hand that suggested he was shooing away particularly persistent flies. He didn't watch them leave, he was too busy inspecting the sediment in his beer glass. I escorted the quintet to the front door, making sure Thorne didn't accidentally pocket the silver shoehorn in the hallway, and watched them disperse into the Manhattan night. They didn't speak to each other on the sidewalk, which was a nice touch. It's hard to coordinate a story when you're all busy wondering which one of you is the designated sacrificial lamb. I returned to the office and found Wolfe with his eyes closed. He wasn't asleep, he was relativizing, which is what he calls it, when he's trying to fit a square peg of a lie into the round hole of the truth. "Well," I asked, leaning against the edge of my desk. "The widow has ice water in her veins, Thorne has a gambling debt written all over his twitchy left hand, and the lawyer, Holloway, acts like she's billing us by the minute. Which one do you want me to shake first?" "All of them, Archie, but start with the periphery. Mr. Miller, the one who looks as though he's being pursued by a swarm of invisible bees. He is the weakest link in their collective chain. And find out why Julian Thorne's tailor hasn't been paid in 14 months. A man at his station does not wear a turned collar unless his credit has evaporated. Right. The pavement beckons. The next morning the sun was hitting the brownstone at an angle that made the dust motes look like they were working overtime. I had breakfast Fritz shredded eggs with chives, which are the only reason I stay in this Joe band, headed out into the crisp March air. My first stop was Vance Holloway. It was one of those places where the carpets are so thick you need a compass to find your way to the receptionist, and the wood paneling is harvested from trees that probably saw the signing of the Magna Carta. I spent 3 hours playing the part of an insurance investigator with a personality just annoying enough to make people want to talk to me. So ID go away. It's a specialized skill. I learned that Miller wasn't just a junior associate. He was the man who handled Arthur Vance's private ledgers. The kind of ledgers that don't go to the IRS. I caught Miller as he was sneaking out for an early lunch at a deli around the corner. He saw me and nearly dropped his briefcase into a puddle. "Mr. Goodwin, I told Mr. Wolfe everything I knew last night." "Sure you did," I said, steering him by the elbow toward a corner table. "And I am the Queen of Romania. Sit down, Miller. Have a pastrami on rye. It's on the house, or rather, on the expense account of a man who weighs 1/7 of a ton and has no patience for shy accountants." Miller sat. He looked like he was vibrating. "I can't talk about the firm's business, professional ethics. Ethics are for people whose clients aren't dead," I told him, leaning in. "Arthur Vance thought enough of you to put you on a list of people who might want him dead. That's a hell of a promotion. Now, why was he looking at his own ledgers at 2 a.m. the week before he was killed? And why did he suddenly move $60,000 into a blind trust?" Miller's glasses fogged up. "It wasn't a trust. It was a settlement. He was being squeezed, Mr. Goodwin. Not by a stranger. By family." "Do?" Miller nodded frantically. "Julian had some trouble in Atlantic City. Serious trouble. He came to the office screaming that if Arthur didn't help him, there would be a scandal that would ruin the Vance name. Arthur told him to go to the devil, but 2 days later Arthur changed his mind. He seemed terrified. Not of Julian, but of what Julian had found out. I made a note in my book. What did Julian find out? I don't know, I swear. But after that meeting, Arthur started writing letters. Dozens of them. He was a man preparing for a siege. I left Miller to his pastrami and moved on to the Thorne residence. It was a penthouse that screamed old money but whispered current bankruptcy. I didn't get past the butler, but I didn't need to. I spent 20 minutes in the service entrance talking to a delivery boy who told me that the Thorne household had stopped taking deliveries from the high-end butcher 3 months ago. They were living on canned soup and bravado. By 4 o'clock, I was back in the neighborhood, stopping at a small boutique where Evelyn Vance was known to spend more than I make in a year. The clerk there was more than happy to gossip once I flashed a 20. Apparently, the grieving widow had been seen having a very unwidow-like lunch with a certain lawyer named Holloway just 2 hours after the funeral. They weren't crying. They were arguing over a document that looked suspiciously like a revised will. I walked back to the brownstone, my legs aching and my brain humming. I had a ledger of enmities that was growing by the hour. Thorne was broke, Miller was scared, the widow was conspiring with the lawyer, and everyone was lying about the weather. When I walked into the office, Wolfe was exactly where ID left him, though he had progressed to his 3rd bottle of beer. Theodore had sent a spray of dendrobium that looked like a cluster of frozen white stars on the desk. "You're late," Wolfe grumbled, not looking up from a book on Yugoslavian history. "Im not late, im thorough," I countered, tossing my notebook onto his blotter. Thorne is a pauper in a silk shirt. Miller is a fountain of nervous leaks, and the widow is getting cozy with the lawyer. They are all circling the carcass, but here's the kicker. Arthur Vance wasn't just murdered. He was being blackmailed by his own nephew, and he liked it so little he started a paper trail that leads straight back to this room. Wolfe shifted his weight, the chair groaning in sympathy. He finally looked at me, his yellow gold eyes sharpened to a point. "A paper trail, Archie, or a fuse. Take your pick. But someone is getting desperate. I felt a tail on me for 3 blocks near the firm. Not a Prue. Someone who drives a car like Thayer trying to kill the transmission. Indeed." Wolfe tapped his fingers together. "The pressure is beginning to register. We shall see who cracks first when the sanctity of this house is violated. Go up and tell Fritz we shall have the squabs for dinner, and archaeolock the basement door. I have a premonition that our guests are no longer content to wait for an invitation." I went to the kitchen, but I didn't go to the basement right away. I had a feeling the violation had already happened. I could smell another kind of smoke in the air, and it didn't come from Fritz's stove. The transition from a quiet investigation to a personal affront occurred at approximately 7:15 that evening. I had just finished relaying the news about the squabs to Fritz and was heading down to the basement to check the bolts, as Wolfe had suggested. The brownstone is built like a fortress, but even a fortress has its weak points if the garrison gets too comfortable. I flicked the light switch at the top of the stairs, and the yellow glow spilled down over the stone steps. The air in the basement usually smells of damp earth, seasoned oak, and the faint, sharp tang of the furnace. But as I reached the bottom step, I smelled something else. A cool, floral draft that didn't belong in a cellar in March. I looked toward the small, high window that let out onto the service alley. It was latched, but the glass was smeared. Then I looked at the wine rack. Wolfe's wine cellar is a thing of beauty and terrifying organization. He treats those bottles with more reverence than he treats most world leaders. I noticed it immediately because the gap was like a missing tooth in a movie star's smile. The 1075 D. Oliveira Maderath, very bottle Arthur Vance had promised in his letter was gone. I didn't run back upstairs. Running suggests panic, and I don't give Wolfe the satisfaction of seeing me ruffled. I walked back up, entered the office, and leaned against the doorframe. Wolfe was just reaching for his glass of beer. "I have 2 pieces of news," I said. "The good news is that the basement door was locked tight. The bad news is that someone doesn't need a door to commit a felony. Your Madeira has checked out without paying the bill." Wolfe froze. The glass didn't reach his lips. He sat perfectly still for 10 seconds, which is a long time when you're a man of his displacement. When he finally moved, it was only to set the glass down with a precise, clinical click. "The D. Oliveira," he whispered. "It wasn't a question, it was an epitaph." "Gone," I confirmed. The window latch in the back was manipulated from the outside with a piece of wire. A slim gym job. They didn't touch the gin, they didn't touch the cognac, and they didn't touch the 1921 Montrachet right next to it. They wanted the prize. Wolfe's face didn't turn red, it turned a very pale, dangerous shade of alabaster. His jaw tightened until the muscles stood like cords. This wasn't just a theft, it was a trespass against his soul. The brownstone was no longer a sanctuary. It had been breached by the very vulgarity he spent his life avoiding, Archie. Who knew of that bottle? Vance's clerk, for one. He delivered the letter. Miller, because he runs ledgers. Probably the widow and Halloway, if they've been auditing the estate. And Thorne, if he's been looking for anything he can hawk for 10 cents on the dollar. "It is not about the value," Wolfe snapped, his voice crackling with a cold fire. "It is about arrogance. To enter this house, to bypass our security, to lay hands on a legacy meant for mate is an admission of extreme desperation. They believe the bottle contained more than fermented grapes. They believe it contains a secret. A secret. It's a bottle of wine, Wolfe. Unless Vance tucked a microfilm under the label, I don't see do not be fatuous." Wolfe cut me off. "A man like Arthur Vance does not use a timed release letter to offer a gift of wine unless the gift itself is a vessel." He was a master of unnecessary logic. He knew that mentioning this specific bottle would act as a beacon. He didn't just give me a reward, he gave me a lightning rod. I whistled. "So, whoever took it isn't he looking for a drink? They are looking for whatever Vance hid inside the packaging or the provenance of that bottle, and they were willing to risk your wrath to get it. They have achieved more than risk," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a level that made the back of my neck prickle. "They have achieved the inevitable." I was content to let this proceed at a scholarly pace. I was willing to wait for the patterns to settle, but they have brought their filth into my cellar. He leaned forward, his massive hands gripping the arms of his chair so hard the wood groaned. "Call Saul Panzer. I want him here tonight. I want Ori Cather and Bill Gore on the periphery. If anyone so much as sneezes near a Vance property, I want to know the velocity of the mucus. And Archie? Yeah, boss, contact the widow. Tell her that a grave error has been committed. Tell her that I am no longer merely an interested observer of her husband's death. I am now the architect of her misfortune if that bottle is not returned Juno panned. You think she has it? I think she knows who does. A woman who conspires with her lawyer over a fresh grave does not miss the disappearance of a priceless vintage from the estate inventory. She is playing a game of shadows, and she has forgotten that I live in them. I went to my desk and started the round of calls. Saul answered on the second ring, his voice cool and ready. He's the only man I trust to do legwork, and I do, mostly because he doesn't have my distracting charm to get in his way. As I spoke to Saul, I watched Wolfe. He wasn't drinking his beer anymore. He was staring at the empty space on his desk where the letter had been. The disruption was complete. The case had shifted from a dead man's puzzle to a living man's war. The suspects had made a mistake, had made it personal, and in this house there is no greater sin than disturbing Nero Wolfe's peace. Saul's on his way, I said, hanging up. He'll be here in 20 minutes. Good, Wolfe said. He stood up, a rare, ominous movement that signaled the end of his evening's rest. I'm going upstairs to the orchids. I need to look at something that is incapable of deceit. When Saul arrives, tell him the hunt has moved from the library to the gutter. We are no longer looking for a murderer, Archie. We are looking for a thief who thinks he is clever. He moved toward the elevator, his silhouette looking like a mountain range in the dim light of the hallway. I stayed in the office, checking the clip on my 38. It was going to be a long, cold night, and the brownstone felt a little less like home and a little more like a trap. Saul Panzer arrived at the south door 20 minutes later, looking exactly like a man you would never notice in a crowd of 3. He had his old cap pulled low and a coat that had been designed for utility rather than vanity. Saul doesn't have my flair for a well-tailored suit, but he has a memory like a steel trap and the patience of a gargoyle. I let him in, bypassed the pleasantries, and brought him straight to the office where the air was still vibrating from Wolfe's departure. The big man is ruffled, Saul noted, his eyes scanning the room and settling on the empty beer glass. I could hear the elevator gears groaning from the hallway. What's the damage, Archie? Someone broke into the cellar and swiped a bottle of 1875 Madeira, I said, leaning back against my desk. It wasn't just any bottle. It was the centerpiece of a dead man's puzzle. Wolfe is taking it as a personal declaration of war. He wants the perimeter tightened until it squeaks. I spent the next 10 minutes briefing him on the quintet: Thorne, the pauper, Miller, the jittery clerk, Evelyn, the ice queen, and Halloway, the legal shark. Saul listened without interrupting, rubbing his nose occasionally, which is as close as he gets to a theatrical reaction. When I finished, he nodded slowly. If they went for the bottle, they aren't worried about the law, Saul said. They are worried about what's behind the curtain. A man doesn't risk Nero Wolfe's temper for a drink, even a vintage one. He'll pick up Thorne. If he's as broke as you say, he's either the one who did the climbing or the one who's trying to sell the loot to a fence by midnight. Good. He'll take the widow and the lawyer. They are staying at the Vance townhouse on 72nd Street. I have a hunch they are doing more than just mourning over the silver. Saul vanished back into the night, slipping away like a shadow under a door. I went up to my room, grabbed a heavier coat, and checked the hallway. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the elevator as Wolfe descended from the plant rooms. He did not return to the office. He went straight to the kitchen to consult Fritz. When Wolfe is truly incensed, he eats. It's the only way he can provide enough ballast for his brain to function under pressure. I took the Heron and drove uptown. The Vance townhouse was a limestone monster that looked like it had been built to withstand a siege. There were lights on in the second-floor library. I parked half a block and waited. It didn't take long for the pressure to register. Around midnight, a taxi pulled up. Miller, the nervous clerk, scrambled. He didn't ring the bell, he used a key. That was a new development. A junior associate having a key to the boss' private residence usually means he's either a trusted confidant or a very efficient accomplice. 10 minutes later, Julian Thorne's battered sports car screeched to a halt behind the taxi. He didn't have a key. He pounded on the door until Halloway let him in. The circle was closing, but it wasn't closing around Wolfe. They were huddling. I stayed in the car, keeping the heater low and my eyes peeled. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Saul. Archie, I am at a shop on 4th Avenue. A high-end wine merchant who stays open for special clients. Thorne was here an hour ago. He didn't have the bottle, but he had the label. He was trying to get a valuation on it without showing the goods. The merchant told him to get lost, but Thorne dropped a name. He said the real prize wasn't the liquid, but the cork. The cork? I repeated. That's a new one. Did he say why? No, but he's heading your way now. He looked like he was ready to jump out of his skin. I am trailing him, but stay sharp. There's a black sedan that's been hovering a block behind me since I left the shop. It isn't the police. Copy that. They are all at the townhouse now, Saul. It's a full house. I hung up and watched Thorne's car. The black sedan Saul mentioned appeared a minute later, cruising slowly past the Vance residence before parking in a dark patch near the fire hydrant. 2 men stayed inside. They weren't wearing expensive overcoats, they were wearing the kind of hats that stayed low over their eyes. The situation was changing from a cerebral exercise into something much more physical. Wolfe likes to sit in his chair and move us like chess pieces, but the board was starting to catch fire. If the real prize was in the cork, and everyone was gathered in one house with a couple of hired guns watching the door, the time for subtle observations was over. I got out of the Heron, making sure to stay in the shadows of the neighboring stoops. I needed a better vantage point, and I needed to know what was happening inside that library. I found a service alley that led to the rear of the townhouse. The fence was 6 feet of wrought iron, but I've had practice with better obstacles. As I dropped onto the patio, I heard the muffled sound of a glass shattering inside. Then came a woman's scream, not a scream of terror, but of pure, unadulterated rage. "You fool," Evelyn Vance said. "You've ruined it. If the seal is broken, the whole thing is worthless." I approached the French doors, keeping my back to the stone wall. Through the gap of heavy velvet curtains, I saw them. The 5 were gathered around a mahogany table. In the center sat the 1875 Madeira, or what was left of it. The bottle's neck had been snapped. Miller was holding a pair of tweezers, and Thorne was leaning over his shoulder, his face slick with sweat. Halloway was standing by the door, a small silver pistol held loosely in her hand. She wasn't pointing it at anyone yet, but she looked like she'd practiced the stance. "It's not in the cork," Miller stammered, his voice cracking. "There's nothing here but old bark and rot." Arthur lied. He lied to all of us. He didn't lie. Wolfe's voice suddenly boomed, not from the room, but from my memory of his office. I realized then that the letter hadn't been a map to the bottle. It had been a map to the person who would go to the bottle first. I pulled my eye. 38, and prepared to make an entrance. But then I saw the black sedan's occupants moving toward the front door. The outsiders were moving in. I had a choice: stay and watch the collapse, or intervene before the brownstone lost its chance at the truth. I opted for the noise. I kicked the French doors open, the glass spraying across the expensive rug. "Evening, folks," I said, the barrel of my gun catching the light. "I hope you saved a glass for me. Mr. Wolfe is very particular about his vintage shares." The room froze. Halloway turned the pistol toward me, but she was a second too slow. I've always been faster than the legal profession. "Drop it, counselor," I snapped, "or I'll have to explain to the DA why you're wearing a hole in your Chanel suit." She dropped it. But the look on Evelyn Vance's face told me the broken bottle was the least of my problems. Arthur Vance hadn't set the real trap. The person standing right next to I had set it. The standoff in the library had the kind of brittle tension that usually precedes a structural collapse. Evelyn Vance was staring at the jagged remains of the Madeira bottle, as if it were her own reflection shattered on the floor. Halloway's silver pistol lay on the Persian rug, like a discarded toy, and Miller looked ready to faint into the mahogany. I kept my 38 leveled at the group, but my ears were tuned to the front of the house. The heavy thud of the front door being forced open echoed through the hallway. Men from the black sedan were no longer interested in surveillance. "Into the corner," I ordered, gesturing with the barrel. "All of you were about to have company, and they don't look like they are here for estate planning." "Goodwin, you don't understand," Thorne wheezed, his hands shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. "That bottle," Arthur told me it was the final ledger. He said if I ever needed to settle my accounts, 1875 was the key. I thought he meant there was a diamond in the cork or a Swiss bank number etched into the glass. "And instead you got a face full of old grapes and a broken neck," I said. "Smart. Arthur Vance knew you were a greedy leech, Thorne. He gave you exactly what you deserved. A long walk off a short pier. The library doors burst open. 2 men in dark overcoats stepped in. They weren't the polished villains you see in the movies. They were the kind of professional muscle that New York produces in bulk-heavy jaws, dead eyes, and a complete lack of curiosity about anything that wasn't their paycheck. One held a snub-nosed revolver, the other a heavy sap. They looked at the broken bottle, then me. The girl said the bottle was here. The one with the gun growled. The girl has bad timing, I countered. And if you mean Counselor Halloway, she's currently reconsidering her career path. You're trespassing on a very expensive rug, boys. I suggest you turn around before I have to start filling out police reports. The gunman didn't turn. He shifted his weight, and for a second, I thought I was going to have to find out if my life insurance was up to date. But then, a voice drifted in from the hallway, a voice that was as familiar to me as the sound of a beer bottle opening. I wouldn't, if I were you, Saul Panzer said. He appeared in the doorway behind the two thugs, his own weapon held with the casual competence that makes people very still. The street is crawling with my associates, and Mr. Goodwin is a notoriously poor loser. Drop the hardware. The two men weighed their options. They weren't paid enough to die in a library. They dropped their weapons, and Saul moved in like a professional shadow, zip-tying their wrists before they could blink. He gave me a quick nod. The black sedan belongs to a firm that specializes in private recovery, Saul explained, hired by a third party to ensure the bottle didn't leave the city. But the third party isn't in this room, Archie. I looked at the suspects. Evelyn was pale, Thorne was a wreck, Miller was weeping silently, and Halloway was stony-faced. But someone was missing, the clerk. The man who had delivered the letter to the brownstone. Where's the messenger, Miller? I asked, stepping over the glass. The little guy who looked like he'd seen a ghost. He was supposed to meet us here, Miller stammered. He was the one who told us Arthur had hidden the real will inside the cellar at the brownstone. He said he saw Arthur do it. He played you, I said, the pieces finally clicking into a pattern that Wolfe would actually approve of. He didn't see anything. He was the one who told Vance to write that letter. He was the one who suggested the Madeira as a prize. He wasn't a clerk, he was the puppet master. I went to the desk phone and dialed the brownstone. Fritz answered on the first ring. Fritz is the genius in the office. He is Archie, but he is not alone. A gentleman arrived 10 minutes ago. He claimed to have returned the stolen property. Mr. Wolfe admitted him immediately. My stomach did a slow roll. Lock the kitchen door, Fritz, and tell Wolfe that the clerk is the one who hired the muscle. On my way. I hung up and looked at Saul. Keep this circus under wraps. I'm going back. The treasure isn't in a bottle and it isn't in a cork. It's in the brownstone. I didn't wait for an answer. I ran for the Heron, pushed the speed limit until the tires screamed, and made it back to West 35th Street in record time. The lights were on in the office. I didn't use my key. I didn't want to announce my arrival. I slipped in through the basement, very way the thief had entered and crept up the back stairs. I reached the office door and paused. Through the crack I could see Wolfe. He was sitting in his chair, as immovable as a mountain, but he wasn't drinking beer. He was holding a small, leather-bound, diary kind Arthur Vance used for his private appointments. Opposite him sat the clerk, whose real name I still didn't know, but whose face was now twisted into something far more predatory than a nervous messenger. You are a man of remarkable patience, Mr. Wolfe, the clerk said, his voice no longer wheezing but sharp and clear. But the diary belongs to the estate. My clients want it back. Mr. Panzer are currently restraining your clients, Wolfe said, his voice a cold, rhythmic thrum. And this diary does not belong to the estate. It belongs to the truth. Mr. Vance did not hide his secrets in a wine bottle. He hid them in the one place he knew a thief would never look, the very envelope you delivered to me. The letter was a distraction, the envelope's lining was the prize. The clerk stood up, and I saw the glint of steel in his hand, not a guna-thin professional blade. "I'll take it now," the clerk whispered. "You will take nothing," Wolfe replied, not even blinking. "Archie, if you are quite finished eavesdropping, I believe this gentleman requires an escort to the precinct." I entered the room, my 38 steady, right on time as usual. "Sorry I missed the first act, boss. I was busy cleaning up the glass at Vance's place." The clerk looked at me, then at the door, then back at Wolfe. He knew the game was up. He dropped the knife and sat back down, his shoulders slumping. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. Arthur was supposed to die quietly. The letter was just to keep you busy while we emptied the vault. You underestimated two things, Wolfe said, picking up his beer glass at last. The first was Arthur Vance's sense of irony. The second was the sanctity of my cellar. You should never have touched Madeira. Wolfe took a long, slow swallow of beer, his eyes fixed on the man who had dared to disturb his peace. The pressure was off, but deconstruction was just beginning. By the time the clock on the mantel chimed 1 in the morning, the office was once again the center of the universe. I had spent the last hour on the phone with Inspector Cramer, who was currently at the Vance townhouse trying to make sense of a broken bottle, 2 zip-tied thugs, and a collection of socialites who were all pointing fingers at each other. Cramer was in his usual state of high-decibel frustration, but I told him to keep his shirt on and send a car for our clerk. The man who had called himself a messenger was now sitting in the witness chair, looking considerably less like a ghost and more like a man who had bet his life on a bluff and been called. His name, as it turned out, was Peter Vanier Distant, disregarded cousin who had spent 20 years in the shadows of Arthur's success, acting as a glorified gopher while plotting a very specific kind of inheritance. Wolfe was back in his element. He had 3 fresh bottles of beer on his desk, and the scowl that had resided on his face since the basement break-in had softened into a look of grim, intellectual satisfaction. He didn't look at the prisoner, he looked at the leather-bound diary he had extracted from the clever lining of the manila envelope. The audacity of the mediocre is always a source of wonder, Wolfe remarked, pouring beer with a hand that was now perfectly steady. Mr. Vane, you believed that by directing me toward a vintage bottle of wine, you could keep my mind occupied with a scavenger hunt, while you and your confederates sanitized the real records of Arthur Vance's career. It worked for 3 days. Vane muttered, staring at his boots. Arthur was a paranoid old fool. He told me he was going to leave everything to a foundation. I couldn't let that happen. Not after all I did for him. What you did for him, Wolfe countered, was murder. You knew that Thorne was blackmailing Arthur, and you used that friction as a screen. You stabbed your benefactor in his library, knowing the police would look at the nephew with the gambling debts or the widow with the cold eyes. But you had a problem. Arthur had already prepared his final Legethis diary, which details your systematic embezzlement of his charitable funds over the last decade. I leaned against the mahogany cabinets, watching Vane's face. The man wasn't a criminal mastermind, he was just a desperate bookkeeper who had finally run out of pages. The letter was a masterpiece of misdirection, Wolfe continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a lecture. You wrote it yourself, mimicking Arthur's hand, and delivered it to me. You included the list of 5 names to ensure I would be distracted by a circle of suspects. You even included the Madeira as a lure, knowing that a man of my reputation would find the promise of such a vintage irresistible. You intended for Archie to go chasing after Thorne and Miller, leaving you free to return to this house under the guise of a helpful messenger to recover the envelope once I had discarded it. But I didn't discard it, I pointed out, grinning. Wolfe doesn't throw anything away until he's sure it isn't a bomb or a dinner invitation. Exactly, Wolfe said. When the bottle was stolen from my cellar, it was not an act of desperation by one of the 5 suspects. It was an act of provocation by you. You needed to escalate the situation. You needed the suspects to gather at the Vance townhouse so that you could lead Archie away from this office. You assumed that once the house was empty, you could slip in, retrieve the envelope with the diary hidden in its lining, and vanish. How did you know? Vane asked, his voice barely a whisper. The lining was seamless. Even Arthur didn't know I'd found it. I knew, Wolfe said, because you made a fatal error in your choice of bait. You mentioned the 1875 D. Oliveira. Arthur Vance was a man of exquisite precision. In his published memoirs, he noted that he had consumed his last bottle of that particular vintage in 1924. He would never have promised me a bottle that did not exist in his cellar. Therefore, the letter could not have been written by him. Someone who knew his tastes but not his history wrote it. Someone who saw the labels in the cellar but never shared the wine. Wolfe took a sip of his beer, the yellow-gold light of the lamp reflecting in his eyes. You violated my home to support a fiction. That was your undoing. You brought a lie into a house built on the pursuit of truth. The doorbell rang these sharp, impatient three-ring signal of Inspector Cramer. I went to the door and let him in. He marched into the office, his hat pushed back, looking like he wanted to arrest the furniture just to calm his nerves. "All right, Wolfe," Cramer barked. "I've got a bunch of them downtown. Holloway is already demanding a phone call, and Thorne is trying to sell his story to the tabloids. What have you got for me besides a pile of broken glass?" Wolfe gestured toward Peter Vane. "I have the man who killed Arthur Vance, Inspector. I also have evidence of his motive, his method, and his monumental stupidity." "Archie, give the inspector the diary, and the knife we recovered from the floor." I handed over the goods. Cramer looked at Vane, then at the diary, and finally at Wolfe. He grunted a sound that, in the Cramer to English dictionary, means thank you, but ill never admit it. "Take him out," Cramer told his sergeant. As they led Vane away, the inspector turned back to Wolfe. "I suppose Yow'll be sending a bill for that Madeira." "The Madeira was a phantom, Inspector," Wolfe said, his eyes already drifting toward the door. "But the insult to my cellar was quite real. I expect the DA to be thorough. I have dinner to finish, and I find that my appetite has been sharpened by the resolution of this farce." Cramer left, muttering about geniuses and their stomachs. I closed the door, bolted it, and walked back into the office. The silence of the brownstone was returning, heavy and comforting. "You know," I said, "we never did get to taste that wine. Even if it was a fake, it was not a fake, Archie." "It was a tragedy," Wolfe said, rising from his chair with the solemnity of a high priest. "To break a bottle of any vintage to hide a ledger of such tawdry crimes is a sin against civilization. Tell Fritz to bring coffee to the cafeteria. I wish to forget that Mr. Vane ever existed." I watched him head for the dining room. The deal was done, templates closed, and the brownstone was once again a fortress. I picked up my notebook, tossed it into the drawer, and followed him. After a night of broken glass and bad relatives, I was more than ready for Fritz coffee. The dining room of the brownstone is a place where the chaos of the city and the vulgarity of the criminal element are strictly forbidden from crossing the threshold. The lighting was soft, the silver was polished to a mirror finish, and the smell of roasting lamb had finally chased away the lingering scent of damp wool and desperation that the suspects had left in their wake. Wolfe sat at the head of the table, his primary focus now directed at a plate of medallions of venison with a sauce of crushed black cherries. To look at him, you would never know that 3 hours ago he had been the target of a man with a professional blade and a heart full of larceny. I sat across from him, attacking my own portion with a bit more speed. I don't have the digestive stamina to treat every meal like a religious ceremony, but when Fritz is in the kitchen, even I find it hard to be cynical. We ate in a silence that was less about tension and more about appreciating a finished job. Wolfe doesn't talk. While he eats, he considers it a waste of sensory input. It wasn't until the salad had been cleared and the coffee black strong and steaming was served that he deigned to acknowledge the existence of the outside world again. "Inspector Cramer called while you were having your second helping," I said, leaning back and lighting a cigarette. "Wolfe doesn't like the smoke, but he tolerates it after a success. They found the rest of the records in Peter Vane's apartment. It seems he wasn't just embezzling, he was planning to dismantle the entire Vance firm and sell it off in pieces to a syndicate in Chicago. Arthur found out, but he was too old and too tired to fight him openly. He thought that by bringing you into it, he could let the inevitable do the heavy lifting." Wolfe grunted, stirring a precise amount of sugar into his cup. "Mr. Vance was a coward, Archie. Brilliant, maybe, but a coward nonetheless. He chose to turn his death into a theatrical performance rather than facing his kinsman in the light of day. He gambled with the peace of this house to settle a score he was too weak to address himself." "Maybe so," I said, "but he knew his audience. He knew you wouldn't be able to resist the bait, and he knew that once someone touched your wine cellar, they were as good as measured for a coffin. You have to give him credit for that. He played you like a Stradivarius." Wolfe's eyes sharpened. He hates the idea of being played, even by a dead man with good taste in Madeira. He did not play with me. He provided a set of variables, and I resolved them. That the variables included a breach of my security is a matter of profound regret, not a tribute to his cunning. The man is dead, his legacy is in shambles, and his widow is currently trying to bribe a precinct sergeant to let her keep her pearls. It is a spectacle of human folly that offers no satisfaction. I don't know, I countered. I got some satisfaction. Seeing Thorne realize that the bottle head risked a prison sentence for was full of vinegar, and lies was worth the price of admission. And Saul got a nice bonus for his trouble. Saul is a professional, Wolfe said, dismissing the thought with a wave of his hand. He understands that the world is populated by people who believe that shortcuts lead to the summit. They never do. They lead to the precipice. Peter Vane thought he could bypass the labor of a lifetime by removing a single man from the board. He forgot that others were watching the board. Fritz entered, carrying a small tray with 2 glasses and a bottle that wasn't from our cellar. He put it with a look of extreme skepticism. "What's this?" I asked. "A delivery, Archie," Fritz said. "A messenger from the DA's office. He said it was recovered from Vance's safe during the search. It was addressed to Mr. Wolfe with a note from the executors." I looked at the label. It wasn't the 1875 de Oliveira. It was a 1914 Buell, a vintage that even Wolfe usually only speaks of in whispers. I checked the handwritten note attached to the neck. It said, "For the man who sees the patterns." The other was a test. "This is the reward." I started to laugh. I couldn't help it. "He got you again, Wolfe. The bottle in the cellar was a decoy. He knew it would be stolen. He knew Yao'd find out it was a fake. He wanted to see if you were as good as the journal said you were before he gave up the real goods." Wolfe stared at the bottle. For a moment I thought he might order Fritz to throw it out the window in a fit of pique. His pride is a delicate thing, and Arthur Vance had poked it twice in 24 hours. But then, slowly, the corners of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. Wolfe doesn't do anything so common, but it was an admission of a draw. "Archie." "Yes, sir." "The 1914 Buell is a wine of exceptional character. It would be a waste of its integrity to let it sit in the company of a dead man's ghost. Open it, now, and bring a glass for yourself. I find that I require a witness to the fact that even a man of my intellect can be subjected to the whims of a ghost. It is a humbling thought, and one that requires a superior vintage to endure." I got the corkscrew. As I worked the cork, I looked out the window at the dark New York streets. The city was full of people like Peter Vane, people who thought they could outrun the truth or outsmart the man in the brownstone. They were wrong, of course. They always were. But now and then someone like Arthur Vance came to remind us that the truth has a sense of humor. I poured the wine. It was the color of liquid amber and smelled like a world where everything made sense. Wolfe took his glass, sniffed it with the concentration of a scientist, and then took a small, meditative sip. "Well?" I asked. "Is it the integrity of the inevitable?" Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing as the flavor settled. "It is better, Archie. That is appetite justice. And it is almost worth the intrusion." I took a sip of mine. It was damn good wine. I looked at the desk, the empty chair, and the quiet hallway. The brownstone was back to normal. "I'll tell you one thing," I said, putting my glass down. "The next time a letter arrives from a dead man, I'm telling him we're out of town." "Do that," Wolfe muttered, though he was already reaching for the bottle to pour a second glass. "But Archie..." "Yeah?" "Make sure he leaves the wine on the stoop." I laughed, finished my glass, and headed for the door to check the bolts one last time. It's a tough job, but someone has to keep the ghosts out so the genius can eat in peace.